Hi class, this is going to be a lecture on Chapter 5, which will be looking at attitudes and how we come to evaluate the social world. I'm going to be asking you a series of 4 questions, and when you are asked these 4 questions, you're going to indicate the extent to which you agree with the statement on a scale of 1 to 5. 1 being strongly disagree, and 5 being strongly agree, and wherever you feel in between. So for the first question, rate how you feel about the statement, engaging in regular physical exercise 3 times a week promotes good health. If you strongly agree with it, you'll rate it a 5, and if you strongly disagree, you'll rate it a 1, and anywhere in between. Eating a variety of foods each day, including 5 or more servings of fruits and vegetables, contributes to wellness. Rate how you feel about that on the scale of 1 to 5. It is essential that all citizens exercise their right to vote if government is to effectively reflect the will of the people. Rate how you feel about that on a scale of 1 to 5. And lastly, homelessness is a serious social problem that needs attention. Rate how you feel about that on a scale of 1 to 5. Now, put those answers aside for just a moment, and I'm going to ask you another series of 4 questions. For these questions, you need to just indicate whether you've done the activity or not. I take time to engage in regular physical exercise at least 3 times a week. Indicate whether or not you've performed that action. I regularly eat at least 5 or more servings of fresh fruits and vegetables each day. Indicate whether or not you've performed that action. I voted in the last election for which I was eligible. Have you performed that action? And within the last year, I've personally done something to address the problem of homelessness. Indicate whether or not you've performed that action. Now take a look at the answers you gave to the first set of questions and compare them with the answers from the second set. You might be noticing something. In fact, it is quite common that what we put as attitudes, our evaluation and ideas about things, often don't match our actions. And sometimes our actions don't necessarily match our attitudes. So what we're going to be talking about in this chapter is attitude formation and how that influences action, which is how we commonly think of things, that we have a certain feeling and then we come to do a particular thing. Towards the end of the chapter, we're going to talk about action and how that can lead to attitude formation. We think of it less often that we do a particular thing and then come to form the attitude, but that does happen too. So the first thing we'll talk about is how it is we come to develop attitudes. So an attitude is basically just a belief or a feeling or something that we sort of hold as an idea about how the world works. It's an evaluation. And how do we come to hold an attitude? How do we come to have an idea or a theory or a way of thinking about things? Well, one way is through social learning. And there are 3 classical learning theories that can also be applied to social learning, and you've probably encountered them before. So classical conditioning is where you learn through paired association. That is, that something is paired with something else, and it comes to take on a certain emotional tone because of that pairing. We'll talk about the classic Pavlovian experiment to illustrate this. So in Pavlov's experiment, he found that when he was going to give the dogs food, before they had actually even received the food, they had started drooling. So food is essentially an unconditioned stimulus for a dog. You don't have to do anything special to get a dog to drool for food, it just happens naturally. So the food elicits drooling in the dog. The food is an unconditioned stimulus. That relationship occurs naturally. But what Pavlov was interested in is whether a paired association with a once neutral object could get the dog to then have the same emotional pairing with that neutral object. So for instance, if he fed the dogs and rang a bell, and fed the dogs and rang a bell, and fed the dogs and rang a bell, over time, would the bell, a once neutral stimulus, take on the effects of a conditioned stimulus? The conditioning being now the dog has the same sort of emotional feelings towards the bell as it once did towards the food. And what he found was that this was in fact the case, that he could ring a bell and the dog would drool just as the dog would have drooled for food. So the once neutral stimulus of the bell now took on the emotional tone of the food. So this is a case of paired learning. So how does this work in terms of attitude acquisition? Well, as your book points out, you can do this in terms of feelings towards people. Your book gives an example of prejudice. If a parent holds a particular prejudicial feeling towards a group, and they don't have to necessarily even say anything, but they become uncomfortable when they're around that group, a child will notice, parent, an uncomfortable feeling when the parent encounters someone from that group. That uncomfortable feeling is negative, and so the child will begin to associate that negative feeling with a member of that particular group. So the child will be classically conditioned. The person from the group who was once a neutral stimulus now becomes a conditioned stimulus for the emotional upset of the parent. So classical conditioning through paired association can teach us about attitudes towards other people. Subliminal conditioning is a type of classical conditioning that forms below our conscious awareness. So I'm just going to skip ahead a slide for a sec and just show you this sort of ad I found in an article about progressives' use of subliminal conditioning during the Sci-Fi Channel's Twilight Zone viewing. So basically, what had happened was this particular researcher had sort of stopped his VCR, and it had sort of stopped on this ad. And then he realized when we went back later, he couldn't find the ad again when he sort of ran through the episode again, and he thought that was a little weird. So he went back and playing it in very, very slow motion, frame by frame, he realized that there was a progressive ad that was only being shown for like a few milliseconds, something that wouldn't necessarily be picked up in our conscious mind. But it was hoped that through subliminal conditioning that the ad would sort of seep in and influence people to go and to buy progressive. Does subliminal conditioning work? Well, experiments have found it does to a certain extent. In one study, students were shown pictures of sort of neutral things, houses and streets and cars and things like that, and just shown for a millisecond in a way that they couldn't see were happy pictures, like kittens and balloons and clowns and things like that. A second group was shown the same neutral pictures, cars and trees and whatnot, houses, but they were shown disturbing pictures, werewolves and open heart surgery and things you wouldn't necessarily like. The researchers then asked the students what their mood was, and the students who were subliminally flashed the disturbing photos rated themselves as much higher in anxiety and fear after having viewed those pictures, even though they did not consciously know they were exposed to the pictures. Whether this consistently works for advertisement hasn't really been demonstrated. There hasn't been any strong effect on these type of ads getting us to go out and buy cleaning products and whatnot, but it does seem that our mind can perceive things and pick up on paired associations even if it is below our conscious awareness. The second way we can develop attitudes is through instrumental conditioning. And if you're a parent, you may have found yourself using this, or if you've been anybody's child, you may have found these things used on you. And that is, instrumental conditioning relies on reward and punishment. That we tend to reward behaviors that we want to see again, and we tend to punish behaviors that we do not necessarily want to see again. So by praising a child for rooting for the particular home team you like, and discouraging the child from rooting for a different team, often we try to shape the child's sports team preferences. Instrumental conditioning, again, is something where you are reinforcing behaviors you want to see and punishing or discouraging behaviors that you don't want to see. And lastly is observational learning. And this is where we learn through a model. We watch a person and what they do, and if they are rewarded for the behavior, we will maybe try it ourselves, thinking something positive might come out of it. If the model, however, does the behavior and they are punished or there's a negative repercussion, we might try to avoid that behavior, assuming that the same thing might happen to us. So, your book notes that even if parents say things like, you shouldn't smoke, but if they smoke themselves and the child perceives it as fun or cool or something like that, they might be likely through observational learning, watching the model, to see that there's more positive benefits than negative to it. I have here a picture from the show Jackass, which has Johnny Knoxville as sort of the star, and they often do tricks and stunts and practical jokes that look really, really funny. But if you've ever seen the show, there's a big disclaimer at the start of it saying, don't try any of these stunts. And one of the reasons for that is that there was a case where a 13-year-old boy had watched this episode, it's called Flaming Idiot, where Johnny Knoxville puts himself in a flame retardant suit, ties some stakes to himself, and rolls himself on a grill and cooks the meat. Of course, even with the flame retardant suit, it's really hot and he's kind of burning and it's sort of funny. However, when the kids who were 13 recreated this, they didn't have the flame retardant suit. And mostly what they did was they put gasoline on themselves and lit it. And of course, this is a really bad thing, and it's not something uncommon. Often kids will do things that seem really, not intelligent, but you can see where TV has portrayed it in such a way that it looks really fun, high on positive reward, and you don't really see a negative outcome. You don't see the star being burnt or hurt. So in the mind of a child, it seems like a really good thing to do. So observational learning and modeling is another way that we come to develop attitudes, by watching other people.